I got my first haircut in 2 years. Please be kind. I didn't expect to want to do an entire video on the Manningtree Witches, but I couldn't help myself. This book is phenomenal. Quick story, I was actually given this as a birthday present almost 1 year ago, and I've only just gotten to it. What's even weirder is last October I did an entire month dedicated to books about witches. I wrote an article, I made a few videos, and I didn't actually read the Manningtree Witches, which was probably the one I wanted to read the most. I can't tell you why, I don't know what happened to my brain, but here I am, having finished this and needing to do a dedicated video on it. The Manningtree Witches is the debut novel by British writer A.K. Blakemore. She's amazing. She has written 2 poetry collections, and she also speaks Mandarin and has translated Chinese poetry into English. She's so cool, and I want to stress that although this is a piece of historical fiction, it sometimes does read like poetry. You can tell this was written by someone who first and foremost got their start as a poet, because this is a literary novel where every single word, every single phrase, every single page, everything has been meticulously chosen. This is not a novel that was kind of slapped together where the author kind of found a voice that worked and went with it. This is a novel that has been crafted so lovingly, so patiently, down to the cellular level. You know when you watch a film, and it's a really, really good film, and you're amazed by all of the different moving parts that all came together to create something perfect. You're amazed by the direction, by the sound design, by the costume design, by the cinematography, by the acting. So many aspects all come together to make this perfect film. That's what this book feels like. But it was all done by one single person. In terms of its character writing, its relationships, its plotting and pacing, in terms of its themes and ideas, in terms of how it's written, the tone that it conveys, everything about it, everything that we consider worth critiquing when it comes to literature is all sharpened to a point here in the Manningtree Witches. A.K. Blakemore is a true craftsman. That's a sexist term, isn't it? Craftsperson of the form of literature. So what's it about? The Manningtree Witches is set during the English Civil War in the 1640s. It's set in Manningtree, which is a real place in Essex. It's a very, very poor, quiet, out-of-the-way little hamlet where nothing goes on, and what's happening right now is that almost all of the men in the village who are fit to do so have left to go fight in the English Civil War, as far as I can tell mostly against the king and for Parliament. Our protagonist is a young woman called Rebecca West. She's in her late teens, and her mother has quite a reputation in their village. She is known as the Beldam West. And she's a quirky character, and the two of them have a very strained relationship. They live alone together, but they do not get on at the beginning, and Becky informs us early on about what she thinks of her mother, and also what other villagers think of her mother. Rebecca West has also developed an enormous crush on a clerk who lives in the village. This clerk is called John Eads, and the two of them begin a kind of burgeoning maybe relationship very, very slowly over the course of the novel. But another man moves in. This educated man, this man called Hopkins. He moves in, and he takes up the lease on the local inn. And whispers go around the village about who he is, who he was, where he came from, and we learn that he's Cambridge educated, he's a gentleman, he's a very intelligent, probably wealthy man. The fact that he just moves into this village and just takes up the lease on the local inn means he's got money, and that means he's got power. And slowly, bit by bit, he takes up the mantle of Witchfinder. I guess that's kind of spoiling things because that doesn't really happen until over the halfway point, but it's hard to talk about this book without looking at where it's going because the first half is very slow. It's a gradual build of atmosphere, tone, and mostly characters. But this is a book about witches and witchcraft, and the blurb gives a lot of what I've just said away anyway. So as the book goes on, there is pretty much a wolf and sheep dynamic between Hopkins and all of the women in the village who are all potential prey to this man who has taken it upon himself to be the witch finder of this community. Now, I said at the beginning, and I think this is one of the most important things about the book that makes it such a masterpiece, is the language, and I want to talk about how great the language is. Sometimes you read a piece of historical fiction and the author does their best to plant you in that time period. They will use outdated language that wouldn't have been outdated at the time during the century that it's set in, especially if it's a British novel. A.K. Blakemore is very, very choosy about how she goes about doing that. Occasionally, you get these and thous, you get what I would call, for lack of a better term, Shakespearean language of the Elizabethan-ish period. And it's not ham-fisted. It is delicately interwoven into the rest of the language of the book. It is beautifully chosen to elicit a certain feeling about the time period, about the characters, about the setting. The characters are also rough-spoken. They are very, very poor people from a country community. There's a lot of swearing, there's a lot of crassness, there's a lot of carelessness when it comes to the language. These people are not educated, again, for lack of a better term. The language, especially the dialogue, is purpose-crafted to place you in this time and place and amongst these people. The language is also sometimes playful, again in a kind of poetic way. Almost halfway through the book, things start to change when it comes to the witchcraft element, if you like. And chapter 13, which is titled Vagrancy, begins with a paragraph that I want to read out. And I actually put this on my Instagram story a few days ago, but it's so beautiful and also kind of playful, and I think it demonstrates the beauty of the language in this book, so I'm going to read it out to you. Picture a crooked old woman dressed in rags, who labours through deep snow alone. Now fray the hem of her gown and soak it in meltwater. Cover her balding head with a thin shawl of worsted. She smells. You can smell her from an arm's length away, of grease and chicken shit and mildew and embarrassment. The hair she has left, leave it to mat and tangle in yellowing snarls and charm knots. Choke the lucid blue of her eyes with a scum of cataract. Now hunch her over a walking stick and set her to trudging. Slow. No, slower than that. Perhaps a few crows rail at one another in the glassy hedgerows as she passes, but otherwise all is silence. She is alone on the rolling fields of a deep, unpromising white. Now empty out her belly. Now decide. Will you offer her help? Do you even want to touch her? This is such a fantastic paragraph. This is the kind of paragraph that you would see open a novel. It's the kind of paragraph that a writer would put all of their energy in at the very beginning of chapter 1 to really hook their audience in, to wow a potential agent or editor, to really set the tone and show off their command of language. I've seen it done so many times by authors, especially debut authors, who put so much into their opening page. But this is halfway through the book. This is just one paragraph that opens chapter 13 and really just captivated me in its playfulness and its poetry and the way that it turns to the reader and asks you to not only picture this person, but kind of piece her together like she's made of Lego. Oh, it's just playful. But this isn't a playful book, it's a heartbreaking, heart-wrenching book full of very, very deep themes. And it still manages to play with language in that way and pull it off. Now, as I said, there are deep, deep, dark themes at play here. When it comes to books about witches, especially books written by women about witches, historical fiction about witches, etc., so much of it is very, very obviously feminist fiction, anti-patriarchal fiction, my favourite fiction. But this goes even deeper than that. It's very obvious that the Manningtree Witches is about feminism, is about patriarchy, is about the power imbalance between men and women, and it looks at the time period specifically. Men being educated, men having the power, men having dominance over women in their households, in their towns, in their villages. These men have gone to school, etc., etc. And yeah, that's been done before, and I love to see it. I love that women authors of this caliber so cleverly highlight the power dynamics and imbalance between men and women throughout history. This is all great stuff. Not the imbalance itself, the literature. But Blakemore takes it even further. Beyond it being a feminist novel, it's also a novel about class divides. This isn't just a man asserting his power over a group of women. It's a rich person asserting their power over a group of poor people. This is a town of uneducated, poor people who go about very, very dull, mundane lives. At the beginning of the book, it establishes just how much they rely on things like gossip to get through the day. Gossiping between one another is their hobby. And this gossip is not really paranoid, but it becomes paranoid when a man comes in and kind of encourages that paranoia, gives them ideas. He is manipulating the people around him. He is taking something that people already do, gossiping, and makes it paranoid, makes it superstitious, makes it supernatural. He is manipulating the power dynamics of a poor community. And not only that, but this man is Cambridge educated, he can read, he has money, he has formed a physical base within this town to lord himself over everyone. The power dynamics go way beyond gender. They go into rich versus poor, educated versus uneducated, and even people who understand habits, manipulating those who have habits or have daily routines that they're not even consciously aware of, it's just how they live. It's all about power dynamics, but those power dynamics are broad and they go beyond just gender, and I am so impressed with that. One reviewer on the back said, "I loved this riveting, appalling, addictive debut. Blakemore captures the shame of poverty and social neglect." Yes, absolutely. That's exactly how this feels. There is such an air of power imbalance when it comes to the lucky and the unlucky. Those who live in and grew up through and were able to access luxury, and those who live and survive in poverty. Thematically, there is so much going on here. That stuff is then supported further by the language and by the characters. Rebecca West is a wonderful protagonist. I love how she begins the novel with a description of her mother, talking about her everyday labours, her everyday activities. It's a very slow beginning, it's a slow crawl. The language makes it enthralling. The language does not weigh down the slowness of the book, but instead enhances it and makes it entertaining slowness. It makes it a joy to just live in her life at the beginning. And it's also sometimes darkly funny. There's a passage where she decides to stay with her best friend for a night because she can't stomach her mother. She's sick of her mum, so she goes to stay with her best friend. The two of them are lying in bed together, gossiping and giggling together, and then one of them pulls out a cabbage, and she blindfolds the other and has her touch the cabbage and draw with a piece of charcoal on paper what the cabbage looks like. It's a kind of game of divination and superstition, I guess. It's kind of like reading tea leaves. And Rebecca says, you need to be careful because if your mum sees you do this, she's going to describe it as supernatural. And her friend says, but it's not supernatural, is it? It's a cabbage. And I just love that. The delivery of that made me laugh out loud. And there are quite a few moments like this in the book, especially early on. And then it gets bleaker and darker and heavier and scarier as the stakes are raised throughout the book. There is so much here thematically in terms of its characters and its plotting and its events, and most importantly for me, its language. This really is a masterpiece, a 300-page masterpiece of British historical fiction, of literary fiction, and I have been addicted to it over the last few days, and I already can't wait to start it again. The Manningtree Witches is perfect. I love this book, I love it, it is spellbinding, please read it, please join my Patreon, and please subscribe for books.